So in this video, we're going to be looking at comparing fractions again. In the last section, we were talking about using the benchmark 0, half, and 1/2 to compare the size of fractions, but now we're going to be focusing more on the half benchmark, because sometimes you can have fractions that are a little bit less than half or a little bit more, and how do we determine the difference? Okay, so we'll start off with what is half? Well, half means that exactly equal to half, in order to have an exact half, you need an even number, so 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, and such on and so forth. So on and so forth, I should say. So to have an exact one, you need an even number in the bottom, and then the top has to be exactly half of that number on the bottom. So if you look at this one, half of 4 is 2, half of 6 is 3, half of 8 is 4, half of 10 is 5, and so on and so forth. So you want to know exactly what the halfway point is, and if it's an even number, you just divide that number by 2, and it tells you what the exact halfway point is. So that's your starting point. Okay, now if we're going to look at fractions that are slightly less than the benchmark, so that means that if you have a fraction like 12, you know that exactly 12 is half of 12. Half of 12 is 6. So 5 is under 6, which means if you were drawing an area model, let's say, okay, what you would get is 5 out of 6, we'd have 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's just under. You can see in order to be exactly half, it would have to have this last piece filled in. Okay, so if you look, it's a lot easier to do for even numbers, because we know for 18, half is 9, so that's slightly less. Well, for odd numbers, it's a little bit trickier, okay? Because half of 9 is 4.5, so 4.5. So you'd have to know that to know that 4 out of 9 is slightly less than half, okay? So drawing an area model for these, as long as your drawing is accurate, may be the best way to do that. And again, you could use the online fraction sorter to gauge if you don't know for an odd number. Generally, half of 9 is 4.5, for example, and half of 15 is 7.5, so these two are slightly less. So there's going to be a tipping point for odd numbers where either 4 is where it's less than half, 5 would be more than half, but there is no exact half that you'll encounter. So keep that in mind with odd numbers. Is it more or is it less? Find roughly where the halfway point is, and then just determine whether or not which side of that halfway point. For example, 11 halfway would be 6.5, so, or sorry, 5.5, so 5 is slightly less than that. And the same thing applies for being slightly more than a half. So again, with even numbers, half of 12 is 6, so 7 is bigger, so we know that's slightly more than half. Half of 18 is 9, so 10 is slightly bigger. But when you get to the odd numbers, then again, it's that tipping point. 4 is less than half, 5 is over half. There's no real in between. So you just kind of have to, you may have to go back and use your division and divide 15 by 2, and you would get 7.5, or 7 remainder 1, and then 8 is slightly above that tipping point. So you just have to, with the even numbers, it's a little bit easier. With the odd numbers, you may have to go back and do some long division. But the key is just knowing, again, especially with even numbers, knowing what the halfway point is and whether the number on top is more or less than the halfway point. And in these cases, they're all more. Okay? If you have any questions, see your instructor.